Hi, I'll continue with paragraph 27 from the chapter on the brace from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen. So we get to the elephant in the room. Regarding the long bow over the last figure in 63, Bach refers us to what he said about the Prall-Trill and the long bow over its last figure in figure 45, which is to be found in paragraph 30 from the chapter on trills. In the first edition from 1753, it reads: Ungeachtet sich bei dieser der oberste Bogen vom Anfange bis zu Ende erstreckt. So werden doch alle Noten bis auf das letzte F angeschlagen, welches durch einen neuen Bogen so gebunden ist, dass es ohne Anschlag liegen bleiben muss. Dieser große Bogen bedeutet also bloß die nötige Schleifung. So we're back at the Prall-Trill scam. That was the correct version. There's an altered version, which is the scam. And as far as the scam is concerned, the doctoring that was done to that text in paragraph 30 will do and has done the same damage to this compound ornament as it does and has done to the Prall-Trill. I've seen that the altered text is already in the second edition from 1759, which had still been published by Bach himself. Incidentally, in their bibliographische Hinweise, their bibliographical references, Bärenreiter says the second edition enthält keine textlichen Änderungen, ist aber neu gesetzt. So they say the second edition from 1759 doesn't have any changes to the text, but it's newly set, and that's to do with printing and the plates and stuff. And there was a list of print mistakes at the back of the first edition, so those mistakes were corrected in the 1759 edition, and certain spellings were changed. So according to Bärenreiter, there should be no differences in the text between the first 1753 edition and the second 1759 edition. So what did they see in the 1759 edition that they looked at? Surely they wouldn't have said that what they said about no changes to the text had they seen the small but consequential change to paragraph 30. Not our roll of honour. Oh no. So on that, the change, and I'll read out the altered version, that might be small, but it's structure bearing in a way, and I'm sure people know the cartoon or the meme, whatever you'd call it, you know, in a supermarket where there'll be tins stacked, and you'll see the customer reaching for a tin at the bottom or something, and one knows or can anticipate the joke is that when the customer takes that tin, that the whole display is going to fall to the ground. So that's just, you know, just by removing one tin. So that shows that the change doesn't have to be that great for it to kind of topple the entire thing. And that's this change. So the altered version is incorrect. How it snuck its way in there, I don't know. But I will be offering a theory. Was the 1759 edition, still self-published by Bach, the scene of the crime as it was first committed? Here's the altered text. Ungeachtet sich bei dieser der oberste Bogen vom Anfange bis zu Ende streckt. So werden doch alle Noten bis auf das zweite G und letzte F angeschlagen, welche durch einen neuen Bogen so gebunden sind, dass sie ohne Anschlag liegen bleiben müssen. Dieser große Bogen bedeutet also bloß die nötige Schleifung. The text here is incorrect. It says all notes are to be struck except for the second G and the last F, meaning that only 3 out of a total of 5 notes are to be struck. All the notes except for 2/5 of them, which via A or one new bow, durch einen neuen Bogen, are so tied that they have to stay lying without being struck. What that version of the Prall-Trill requires, however, is not 1 but 2 new bows. 2 neue Bögen. There's the long bow from beginning to end, and then in the execution there is needed 1 new bow to tie the G's together, and a second new bow to tie the F's together. The sentence is incorrect. It would have to read: So werden doch alle Noten bis auf das zweite G und letzte F angeschlagen, welche durch 2 neue Bögen so gebunden sind, dass sie ohne Anschlag liegen bleiben müssen. That's the first thing. The next thing is that the notation doesn't adhere to the text. There is not one single musical example from Bach, either originally so or corrected by him, to coincide with or to support the altered text. That's why you're looking at Edition Schott's notation on the screen whenever I'm dealing with the doctored version, because there is nothing from Bach I could use. What I find hard to believe is, if the altered text wasn't Bach's doing, which I claim it wasn't, how, 1, it could appear in the still self-published 1759 edition. Bach sold the rights of his Versuch to a publisher in Leipzig named Engelhard Benjamin Schwickert, so Benjamin Schwickert, who also acquired all the remaining unsold copies of the 1759 edition and re-released them in 1780 with a new title page. In a letter to Schwickert from April 1780, which I saw in an article entitled CPE Bach's Essay, an introduction by William J. Mitchell from the Musical Quarterly, that was in October 1947, as published by the Oxford University Press, Bach wrote, I can now say with certainty that I still possess 260 copies of Part 1 and 564 copies of Part 2. In that article, Mitchell claims Bach expressed his willingness to turn over control of the work to Schwickert. And this Mitchell guy, he's the one who translated the Bach's book with that title, you know, The True Art of Playing Keyboard Instruments, which is an incorrect translation of the title of the book. It is The True Way to Play the Piano, Essay on the True Way to Play the Piano. So, Bärenreiter say the 1780 edition, in the bibliographical references, they say the 1780 edition was an unchanged reprint of the second edition, a Druckbildübernahme, a print image transfer. And I'd wonder, is that an important detail? Before that, however, back in 1759, Schwickert had not yet gained control of Bach's material. Bach still had full control. So how could the alteration have appeared in the 1759 edition if it wasn't Bach's doing? How is that possible? And 2, how in the 21 years between 1759 and 1780 could it be that nobody brought it to Bach's attention? How could he not have noticed the doctored text? He taught classes, roomfuls of students. I know this because he talked about it in part 2 of his Versuch. And in an open letter he wrote, a lot of which I'll soon be reading, there is as well evidence of his interaction with students. Did none of them wonder enough to ask him about it? Nowadays, this discrepancy is a source of debate and discussion and of confusion. Those that want to believe the altered text, and I'd guess that would be all of Lilliput's roll of honour, they don't have the musical examples to correspond. They had to change them themselves to make them fit. Whereas I don't have hard proof to smoking gun. I only have circumstantial evidence to prove the foreign manipulation. So regardless of what side of the fence one finds oneself, what is common to both is the feeling that an explanation is owed. The teaching method employed by Bach in his classes involved encouraging and assisting his students into exercising high levels of critical thinking. It's hardly likely that in those 21 years, if no one else, then not one of his students could have approached him with the second 1759 edition and said, "Sir, in paragraph 30 on the Prall-Trill, you write that, regardless that the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end, so are nevertheless all notes struck except for the second G and last F, which through one new bow are so tied that they have to stay lying without being struck. But for the second G and the last F to be tied, 2 new bows are needed, not just one. Plus, in the notation, the second bow, the one to tie the G's together, is also missing." If Bach was responsible for the change, he'd have to have said, "Oh yeah, that should read 2 new bows." Regarding the musical notation, maybe he might have said, "I know, it's missing, but it wasn't possible to correct the musical example to add a little bow. Not in 1759, not in 1780, not in 1787, not ever. And that's why it'll stay missing." I can imagine an argument like that being used by the Roll of Honour. But yeah, 1 new bow in the text is a mistake. So he might have said that. I say 21 years because in February 1780 there is a letter from Bach to Schott, and from what Bach says in the letter, I take it he was responding to a request of bonus material and or improvements to the text of the Versuch for a new enlarged edition, Dritte Vermehrte Auflage, published by Schott, which would eventually appear in 1787. Bach wrote, "You would like an expansion for the new edition, an improvement. The improvement is not possible. The text has been taught through as vigorously as it can be. The expansion can take place if you want." If the expansion could take place, then it would also have been possible to add a note in the text to explain the inconsistencies between the altered text and the musical notation, if a correction of the musical notation was not possible. So Bach could have added a short explanation to account for the inconsistencies. The aforementioned open letter by Bach, which appeared in the Hamburger Unparteiischer Korrespondent in January 1773, gives a sense of his stance on incorrectness, inaccuracy, anything that doesn't reflect the truth, the correct answer, and towards the doctoring of the text. I'll read a good bit of it here. "I have observed with greatest satisfaction the change that has come over the world of keyboard playing since the publication of my essay. I can assert without boasting that since its appearance, teaching and playing have improved. And yet I must regret that my high motives have innocently given rise to old and even worse barbarisms. Vain and selfish addlepates, and addlepates are people with muddled or confused minds, are no longer satisfied with playing their own fabrications creditably, and creditably means well enough to deserve praise or approval. So vain and selfish addlepates are no longer satisfied with playing their own fabrications creditably and forcing them on their students. Now, fabrications. This, I imagine, I don't have access to the original, so I couldn't translate it myself, but I'd imagine this is this Mitchell's guy's translation, and I'd say fabrications is not an adequate translation of what Bach was saying there. And Bach has talked about this in the introduction to the book, and he calls it their Mockwerk, and that's like a, yeah, it's not a very complimentary word. And what he'll say is what the teachers do, like at the time it was like it seemed like it was a disgrace or a taboo to give one's students anything that somebody else composed, to give them anything that you haven't made yourself. And so what he says about these teachers is, you know, they can't play the piano, and they can't write anything that they can't do themselves on the piano. So they'll have these horrible compositions that have all the, you know, full of the only things they can do, and it'll cause stiffness. It won't have any, it won't be music, and it'll create all sorts of problems for the students. And so Bach might be referring to the fabrications, but fabrications, I mean, it also means, you know, sort of a lie, basically. Things that are made up and passed off as the truth. And he's talking here about Lilliput's roll of honour. And he's talking about, you know, nowadays those vain and selfish addlepates, they'll be on YouTube. And you can see that there's professors on YouTube. And they are, you know, they have it good, basically. For their abilities and their ignorance, they're doing well. And you know, I've seen one, an American professor, and he's woeful, an atrocious piano player, and he's in a nice room with two nice pianos in it, a Steinway, the one he's playing on, and his playing is horrifying how bad it is. And you think he'd be happy with where he's gotten, because he has done better than his abilities, than he should have done, if you know, if one was to look at his abilities and his lack of insight into music. And instead of thinking he's got a good thing going and being happy that he fools his students into thinking he's worth anything as a teacher, or that they're not, you know, obviously if he has students, which he will, and they're still there, those students are not thinking they're wasting their time going to him, which they actually are. So he thinks, phew, this is good, I've got a good thing going, I won't spoil it. I'll keep my head down and just, you know, thank my lucky stars. But no, he has to go on YouTube, and he has to advertise just how bad he is, how bad the university he is. And I'm surprised that his university, the director, but the director will be just as bad as he is. Don't tell him, get off YouTube, because you're just showing us what low quality we are. You know, so this is who Bach is talking about, the vain and selfish addlepates. And that professor will be forcing on his students all his crapness. And his students haven't got a hope of ever finding music, of discovering music, of getting to know music, of ever being able to play the piano, because they are going to be given all the wrong advice, all these fabrications, and he'll fool them. Yeah, so vain and selfish addlepates are no longer satisfied with playing their own fabrications creditably and forcing them on their students. No, they must seek immortality through authorship. So then they, it wasn't enough for them. They didn't think, I've got a good thing going here as an imposter. No, they want more. It's not enough. So they wanted to seek authority now through YouTube. Then it was through authorship. As a result, so many school and textbooks have appeared since my essay that no end of them can be seen. I have been injured most by those that contain stolen passages, both with and without acknowledgement. Plagiarizing is free to all, and I have nothing to say against it. But it is most harmful to strip plagiarizations of their proper contexts and explain or apply them incorrectly. Everyone knows the damage that can be done by an incorrect fingering, a wrong explanation and application of embellishments, a thoroughly bad chord. I can assert without anger and in truth that every instruction book I have seen since the publication of my essay, and I believe I have seen them all, is filled with errors. What I say can be proved if necessary. So a wrong explanation and application of embellishments. He's talking here about Lilliput's roll of honour. Those who he's talking about are the professors, the musicologists, the people who are publishing books. He's not talking about regular people, the public, people wanting to learn to one day become, a piano player or whatever it is they're aspiring to. He's talking about those established. So he's talking about Lilliput's roll of honour. The mediocrity that wants to eradicate genius. The mediocrity that wants to pull you into its cage. So you can get an idea of Bach's stance on incorrectness. And there as well, he says, since the publication of, he believes to have seen all the books that have, instruction books that have come out since his publication. So one could guess maybe, with regard to what I've said before about Leopold Mozart and the double dot, and Tartini, that Bach will have seen their instruction books. Changing the text from reading one new bow to two new bows would have been an obvious improvement if the altered text was Bach's doing, and if the many discrepancies the altered text created had been as confusing to the people then-a-days as they would be to Lilliput's roll of honour nowadays. Were Lilliput's roll of honour awake and not asleep? Were they not oblivious to the cage? Bach would have had 21 years of questions to answer regarding all the discrepancies the altered text creates, and the vigorous thought Bach gave to the text. In the first 1753 edition, where he must have gotten it wrong if the altered text is the valid version, Bach would have had opportunity to notice the mistake while writing the text with vigorous thought, while writing out the musical example in figure 45, and again by association, while writing the text for the paragraph we're on now, and not only its musical example in figure 63, but also the musical example in figure 66C. One only has to imagine what goes into writing such a musical example. Like Bach said, he was the first to do so. He had nothing to copy. Nothing or no one to copy. It's a very fast ornament. One has to pay very careful attention amidst that speed in order to discern and correctly notate its rhythm. Plus, he could have noticed it when compiling his list of the print mistakes, Druckfehler in der Schrift, that appeared at the end of the first edition, but he didn't. So, despite all that opportunity, apparently he didn't notice the mistake in the first edition. But if the second version is to be believed, then either he didn't know back then how the Prall-Trill was played properly. Is that what the advocates of the doctor's text want to assert? Lilliput's roll of honour do assert that Bach wasn't properly able to use the words before and after, so they're only too ready to paint him out as a moron. You know, that's the hypocrisy, the double standard. They don't mind attacking the giants, just dare not attack the little Lilliput ants. So he didn't know how it was properly played, or he didn't notice the errors, despite the vigorous thought he gave to the text. And he overlooked every single additional bow in the notation. The insertion of such bows would have belonged to the easiest part of the task of notating such figures. If you think just the adding of the bow itself, like the time values that each note gets, wouldn't belong to just simply adding of the bow. So the adding of the bow, that'll be the easiest bit to do of when notating such a figure. Those that believe the altered version will, as a result of Bach referencing that paragraph 30, take it that the first note of this compound ornament in figure 63, an A, is as well meant to be tied to the previous note. You can see Edition Schott does. Bach again forgets to include the bow to indicate this. Oops, silly me, he'll think, because that's the type of guy he is, isn't it? That's the type of guy who wrote that open letter. These are important ornaments. Like I pointed out in the last video, and like Bach said, he was the first to note the compound ornament of paragraph 27, which will make it a little extra special for him. And in doing so, I might add, he described it in text and recorded it in the notation with incredible accuracy and precision. And of the Prall-Trill, he says at the end of paragraph 32 from the chapter on trills, one could perhaps, if needs must, rather do without another embellishment, or, as well, the remaining types of trill, and decorate the performance so that one avoids them and sets other easier ornaments in their place. Only without the Prall-Trill no one can flourish. And if everything else were performed just as well, one, nevertheless, with the lack of this trill, wouldn't be able to be satisfied. Man könnte allenfalls, wenn es sein müsste, eher eine andere Manier oder auch die übrigen Arten von Trillern missen und den Vortrag so einrichten, dass man ihnen aus dem Wege gehen und andere leichtere Manieren an ihre Stelle setzen könnte. Nur ohne den Prall-Triller kann niemand zurechtkommen. Und wenn alles Übrige so gut ausgeführt worden wäre, so würde man dennoch bei dem Mangel an diesem Triller nicht zufrieden sein können. That's how important it is. Are we meant to believe all that vigorous thought he put into the text wasn't enough for him to realise, when preparing the first 1753 edition, that he wasn't explaining the Prall-Trill correctly, nor was he notating it correctly, nor was he notating the compound ornament in figure 63 correctly, nor the one in figure 66c? Or that in 1753 he simply did not know how either were meant to be played, despite their importance, despite the importance he gives them. We got a sense in the open letter of Bach's feelings towards the damage an incorrect explanation, an application of an embellishment can do. When he talked about being able to assert without anger, asserting without anger does not mean to say asserting with indifference or without emotion or passion. Anger is just one emotion. One can assert something without anger, but can still feel passionate about it. You know, that's something to keep in mind when he says I can assert without anger. Doesn't mean he's indifferent about it. One of the versions of paragraph 30 has to be doing the damage. The altering of that sentence in paragraph 30 turns a perfectly written sentence that perfectly coincides with the musical example and everything else Bach says around it to a flawed, sloppy, lazy sentence that coincides with none of the other things Bach says. The altered text, full of errors by a foreign hand, verifies Bach's claim that every instruction book is filled with errors. There's nothing Lilliput's roll of honour can put their hands on that they don't mess up, that doesn't end up full of mistakes. Mediocrity has Lilliput's roll of honour in its grip. Mediocrity is the cage, and they are ruled. Mediocrity rules their life. Mediocrity and genius don't belong to a person. They are things that exist. A person is connected to genius, or he's ruled by mediocrity. Everybody in the cage. Mozart, if Mozart had ended up in the cage, he wouldn't have been Mozart. He would have been just like everybody else, struggling to play a piece from beginning to end. The imaginary student that approached Bach could also say, besides that with the two bows, why do you word it with all notes are to be struck? So werden doch alle Noten angeschlagen. If only 3 of the 5 are struck. That's 2/5 of them that aren't struck. If I had 100 employees, I'm not going to say to them that everyone gets to keep their job when 40 of them don't. I mean, that would be weird if I did. What I'd be saying, only 60 of you get to keep your jobs. 2/5 is a sizable chunk. It's close to half. You also say, this large bow, therefore, merely indicates the necessary legato. Dieser große Bogen bedeutet also bloß die nötige Schleifung. And you say that, regardless that the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end. Ungeachtet sich bei dieser der oberste Bogen vom Anfang bis zu Ende streckt. Is tying the second G not exactly how those that want to believe the altered text would interpret the large bow? And would those that want to believe the altered text, would they not be arguing, and have they not already argued, that the necessary legato means exactly that one doesn't strike the second G? Edition Schott thinks that. So if the large bow is supposed to have that influence or effect, which in the altered text you are essentially saying it should it not simply say, this large bow indicates the necessary legato, without the merely, if that's exactly what it's doing? And should it not say, because the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end, instead of saying, regardless that the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end? Should the correct sentence not go, because the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end, so are nevertheless, and the nevertheless has no business being there either. I'll start again. Because the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end, so are all notes struck except for the second G and last F, which through two new bows are so tied that they have to stay lying without being struck. This large bow indicates the necessary legato. Would that not be the correct sentence? I mean, your original sentence from 1753 was perfect. It was completely perfect. It eliminated any and all ambiguity. So if that's anything to go by, and that's the standard you're at, then the altered text is way below that standard. Never mind the musical notation. And why change the word erstreckt in the original to streckt in the altered version? I've heard from native German speakers that while streckt and erstreckt are interchangeable, erstreckt is the better word in that context. It's the more eloquent word. Why take a better word and replace it with a word that's less good? Why do that? And I'd wonder, was it to save space? Was it to prevent the text, spilling out over onto the next page? And having all of a sudden, in what should be a Druckbildübernahme, a print image transfer, that it suddenly has a different number of pages or something like that, and that'd be more noticeable that a change was made to cause that. So why change erstreckt to streckt? Why delete the better word and replace it with a word that's not as good? But that is, though, in keeping with the overall deterioration of quality when going from the original to the altered version. So this is still the student talking. You say in paragraph 31 from the chapter on trills that the Prall-Trill represents, in short, in brief, a connected trill without a Nachschlag, an afterstroke. Stellt in der Kürze einen, durch einen Vorschlag oder durch eine Hauptnote an die folgende, angeschlossenen Triller ohne Nachschlag vor. In this paragraph 27 you say, it, the compound ornament, represents in brief and in a greater vivacity a connected trill, an angeschlossenen Triller, with an afterstroke. Sie stellt in der Kürze und in einer größeren Lebhaftigkeit einen angeschlossenen Triller mit dem Nachschlage vor. You never once say, however, that in the case of a connected trill, an example of which you see on the screen, that its first note is to be tied to the preceding note when they're the same. Not once do you say that in your Versuch. In paragraph 7 from the chapter on appoggiaturas, you say that all appoggiaturas are struck more strongly than their following notes along with their embellishments, and are joined to them whether there is a slur or not. Ferner lernen wir aus dieser Abbildung zugleich ihren Vortrag, in dem alle Vorschläge stärker als die folgende Note samt ihren Zieraten angeschlagen und an diese gezogen werden. Es mag nun der Bogen dabei stehen oder nicht. So the appoggiatura is joined to the connected trill even though there is no bow. That is the necessary legato, die nötige Schleifung, like in the example on the screen. Instead, however, you say in paragraph 5 that the trill always takes its beginning from the second above the tone. Nimmt allezeit seinen Anfang von der Sekunde über den Ton. You don't say, except in the case of a bow, where, if that second above the tone repeats the preceding tone, it stays lying without being struck. I.e. that what, as far as the propagators of the doctor's text are concerned, is the necessary legato. The necessary legato for them means tying the first note when it repeats the preceding note. But Bach doesn't say that. In paragraph 32, you say this trill is the most indispensable and pleasant, but also at the same time the most difficult embellishments of this Prall-Trill. Dieser Triller ist die unentbehrlichste und angenehmste, aber auch dabei die schwerste Manier. But does tying the second G not remove all the difficulty, making it one of the easiest ornaments to play? Is that not key to the popularity of the altered version? One of the things people love about the early music movement, that such trills are incredibly easy. You say that it has to really impact, and I describe it like a glancing blow. Muss recht prallen. But tying that second G prevents it from ever impacting. The third G impacts or glances off the second G. You say the last struck uppermost tone of the trill is hastened. Der zuletzt angeschlagene oberste Ton von diesem Triller wird geschnellt. That is very specific. The last struck uppermost tone of the trill. But if the first uppermost tone of the trill is left lying without being struck, should it not say the only struck uppermost tone of the trill? It should. Either leave out the struck and say the last uppermost tone, or say the only struck uppermost tone. If you want to be specific and if you want to be correct. Do you want to be either of those things? Bach, sir. You can see that in Edition Schott's version of the Prall-Trill on the screen. The only uppermost tone of the trill that is struck, and that's a C. You can see it. In this paragraph 27, we learn more precisely what the schnellen is, the hastening, thanks to your careful and precise notation. If we don't strike the first uppermost tone of the trill, how can we hasten it the second time it's struck, or, in the case of the altered text, the only time it is struck? Without striking the first uppermost tone of the trill, the speed or regularity of the notes cannot be suitably established. One ends up having two fast notes and two slower notes. The hastening is eliminated. And you say alone this hastening makes it effective. Dieses Schnellen allein macht ihn wirklich. That when one does not play it completely well, it is heard either not at all or in a lame and intolerable manner. Which is contrary to its natural being. Kommt entweder gar nicht zum Gehör oder auf eine lahme und unausstehliche Weise, welche seinem natürlichen Wesen entgegen ist, wenn man ihn nicht vollkommen gut macht. Bach here is describing exactly the damage the altered text causes. And that it happens with an extraordinary speed, so that one has difficulty hearing all the notes in this trill. All the notes in this trill. Dieses Schnellen allein macht ihn wirklich und geschieht mit der im 7. Paragraph angeführten Art und mit einer außerordentlichen Geschwindigkeit, so dass man Mühe hat, alle Noten in diesem Triller zu hören. If the second G isn't meant to be struck, then even at a slow speed, one is not going to hear all the notes of the trill. The roll of honor snakes with their forked tongues can talk around this all they like, but you are not going to hear all the notes of the trill because they are not all being struck. You know, in those roll of honor ones, they'll also dance around the word Ausnahme, when Bach says, wir finden all da auch eine Ausnahme vorgestellt. They'll call that doctored explanation they claim to be his an exception. because Ausnahme is the modern word, German word for exception. But Ausnahme here means Darstellung, is the word for Darstellung, or performance. And I'll be showing another use of that Ausnahme in an upcoming paragraph that shows that there's no way Ausnahme could mean exception. You say these trills have to be played so hastily that one should believe the note above which it is introduced would lose thereby not the least bit of its value, but arrive on a spot at the right time. Dieser Triller kann dahero ebensowohl wie die kurzen Vorschläge über einer geschwinden Note vorkommen, welche demungeachtet nicht verhindern darf, dass dieser Triller deswegen doch so hurtig gemacht werden muss, dass man glauben sollte, die Note, worüber angebracht wird, verlöre nicht das geringste hierdurch an ihrer Geltung, sondern träfe auf einen Punkt zur rechten Zeit ein. Is not the striking of the second G, the first note of the Prall-Trill, that what creates this illusion? Tying the second G creates the effect of a delay because it causes a delay. As Edition Schott, a believer and proponent of the altered text, says, its way of playing with the delay at the beginning is explained from the fact that it is understood as a shortened trill, whose first note is not struck anymore since it is identical to the preceding note. So it's a way of playing with the delay. And there you can see Edition Schott's understanding of the large bow and the necessary legato. What they'll say, why that large bow is there. That large bow is there. The necessary legato is that you don't play that, first note of the Prall-Trill. So you wouldn't be saying regardless that the bow extends, and you wouldn't say it merely indicates the necessary legato. You'd be saying because the uppermost bow extends and it indicates the necessary legato without the merely. And Edition Schott goes on. For with Philipp Emanuel Bach, it can't occur except before a falling second. And in brackets they say the other voices must however be struck beforehand exactly on the time of counting. The other voices being struck exactly on time are going to make the note above which the Prall-Trill is introduced sound like it is coming in late, and not like it is arriving on a spot at the right time. The illusion to which you refer is completely sabotaged. In the appendix to paragraph 24, from the chapter on ornaments in general, you say, as unnecessary as it might seem to remember at the same time that the other voices together with the bass have to be simultaneously struck with the first note which is contained in the ornament, so often is this notwithstanding violated. So überflüssig es scheinen könnte, zugleich zu erinnern, dass die anderen Stimmen samt dem Basse zur ersten Note, welche in einer Manier steckt, zugleich eingeschlagen werden müssen, so oft wird demungeachtet hier wieder gefehlet. Tying the second G, the first note of the Prall-Trill, undermines exactly that. Edition Schott also say in the number 2 appendix to those to the edition of pieces. Die Anbindung der ersten Note bedeutet so viel wie ein kleines selbstständiges Retardando der rechten Hand, während der Bass seine Note punktlich zur Zählzeit, also ein wenig vor der rechten Hand bringt. So the tying of the first note means so much as a small independent retardando of the right hand, while the bass brings its note punctually to the time of counting, i.e. a little before the right hand. This is an example of the fabrication of the edelpates and their creditableness. And when we get to paragraph 29, you will see just how at odds Edition Schott's statement is to what Bach has to say on the subject. Don't forget, Edition Schott here is representing Bach. So the student could ask, do all those things not contradict the altered text? How would Bach answer? Now, in the original version from 1753, none of those contradictions or discrepancies exist, and the musical notations match perfectly. Would Bach say, yeah, all those things would probably need to be changed? And the student could go on. And how are we meant to understand this new compound ornament from what you said on the Prall-Trill? Regardless that with this, the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end. So yeah, the bow in figure 63 extends from the beginning to the end. So regardless of that, so are nevertheless all notes struck. So all the notes are struck. Are we to believe that? That in figure 63 all the notes are to be struck? What about the exceptions? The second A and the last G in the case of figure 63. And Bach would say, well, obviously the last G doesn't apply anymore because it is not repeating the preceding note. So there are no exceptions. So, regardless that the uppermost bow extends from the beginning to the end, all notes are struck. This large bow merely indicates the necessary legato. Is that how we're meant to understand it? I mean, that does fit to the figure 63 musical example and to figure 66C. And if the first edition version from 1753 is the correct version, then Bach would say, yes, that's correct. That's how it's meant to be understood. But the Bach of the altered version, he'd have to say, no, there is an exception, the second A. And the student would respond, so I can't apply what you said about the Prall-Trill because without an extra caveat, it isn't applicable. Yeah, that's right, it isn't applicable. You can't take what I said about the Prall-Trill and its large bow at face value and translate it to this compound ornament by simply excluding the exception because, obviously, the exception can't be excluded because parts of the exception still apply. And that doesn't warrant a mention. Yeah, well, it probably would warrant a mention. The Bach in that conversation doesn't have a clue. Does that sound like Bach? Is that the Bach those of you following this channel are getting to know? The Bach of the world of music? The author of that open letter? Or is it more like Lilliput's Roll of Honours Bach? That false Bach of the cage? The place where nothing exists and nothing is of consequence? Because the proponents of that altered text would have to have ignored all those inconsistencies and contradictions when pledging their allegiance. All those inconsistencies and contradictions they ignored. And who out there is challenging them with them? That's a rhetorical question. I know the answer. So they will have to have ignored all of them, plus the more that have yet to come. I can't cover all of them because it's just too long. But as I get to them, I will include them. And this is to show you that what I say about Lilliput's Roll of Honour is true. And to show you're being lied to. You are giving the responsibility of your education to the wrong people. And they are sabotaging your chances. They are putting you in the cage where they rob you of the chance of ever discovering music for your whole life. That is the crime they are committing. And I'm not saying, they're as well victims of that crime, but the victims then turn into the perpetrators. If you've been kidnapped, you know intimately what it's like to be the one who's kidnapped, but also you have first-hand experience of what it's like to be a kidnapper. That is the other job you know best. It's like kids in school. You know, if you know, when you ask a grown-up, could you be a teacher? And they'd say, oh no, I could never do that, stand in front of a class. Ask any kid, could you be a teacher? They'll say, yeah, of course, it's simple. Why? Because they see it being done every day. They have no fear about being a teacher. You put a kid in charge of the class while the teacher's away, that kid becomes the teacher. They have no problem because they know it intimately. So what are they you know, all of them are victims themselves because they're, but they become the perpetrators. And they have to run away from this channel because they have to run away from the truth because, you know, it doesn't matter. Schwickert acquired all the remaining copies of the 1759 edition and released them with a new title page in 1780. I've seen written in a description accompanying an auction of an original of said edition that so many copies of the 1759 edition printed by George Ludwig Winter in Berlin were left lying around that the remaining stocks were taken over by Schwickert in Leipzig and both parts were given a new title in 1780. In that letter already mentioned, from April 1780, Bach offered Schwickert the remaining copies for 180 louis d'or, so that's the currency. I've also read in an essay entitled New Light on the Last Years of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach by Dragan Plamenak that also appeared in the Musical Quarterly and that was published by Oxford University Press, that Schwickert had manifested interest in taking over the extant copies of previous editions. Manifested interest is an interest that is obvious and clear. That means all copies of the 1759 edition that weren't in the possession of people who'd bought them had passed through the hands of Schwickert. Like I said, Bärenreiter, in their bibliographical references, says the second edition, 1759, enthält keine textlichen Änderungen, ist aber neu gesetzt. So it contains no changes to the text, but it's newly set. I could wonder then if the copies of the 1759 edition that still exist come from Schwickert, and wonder, do any copies still exist of the 1759 edition that he hadn't gotten his hands on, where he wouldn't have had the chance to alter the text, where the text of paragraph 30 might not be altered? Because that to me would explain why Bach was oblivious to all of this, why nobody was approaching him. Because up to the time he wrote to Schwickert in 1780, telling him that an improvement was not possible, that the text has been taught through as vigorously as it can be, the text was still as it had been in the first 1753 edition, that the altered version did not yet exist. If Bärenreiter had looked at a copy of the second edition where indeed there were no alterations to the text, that would be evidence that the sentence hadn't been changed by Bach, and that it had been retrospectively changed or retrofitted to cover up the scam, to create an alibi. But then Bärenreiter say the third 1780 edition is an unchanged reprint of the second edition. So good job, Bärenreiter, true to form. Your champions, the roll of honour. So they didn't spot any change in the text whatsoever. They are oblivious all that. They're too busy saying Bach wasn't able to use the words before and after properly. So just here's for context. Bach died in 1788 at the age of 74. 1 year after the 1787 edition. In 1780, he was 66 years old. Like I said, Bach had sold the rights of his Versuch to Schwickert. Bach, it would appear, was frustrated, exasperated with this publisher. Before publishing the 1787 edition of the Versuch, Schwickert published 4 symphonies of Bach's. It appears that Schwickert was, I read, in an introduction written by David Schulenberg, and he has stuff on the internet, and he's a professor and an editor and stuff. So, David Schulenberg wrote that Schwickert was inexperienced in such music publications, and as well uninterested in the experience Bach brought to the table. I personally think Schwickert might have had more of a mind on his own business strategies than he had on time-honoured methods in the field of music publication. That's my own suspicion. He was one of the leading publishers in the German-speaking market. In the German Wikipedia it says, Schwickert's special talent and key to success lay in the fact that, as buyers of his books, he no longer saw only a small academically educated audience, as in the days of absolutism, but also anticipated the spirit of the Enlightenment with its emerging broad bourgeoisie. As a result, there was suddenly a large market for classical literature, which he was the first to serve, several years before the established publishers became aware of this new clientele. So he was maybe like the Ryanair of publishing. In January 1780, Bach wrote to Breitkopf, another Leipzig publisher, looking for assistance with regard to the symphonies Schwickert was publishing and the unsatisfactory job he was doing of it. Among other things that were to Bach's dissatisfaction, Schwickert was using inferior paper. Bach wrote, Herr Schwickert did not follow the good suggestions I gave him, partly out of forgetfulness, partly out of irritation. Bach talks about the miserable paper in the letter, to which Breitkopf agreed, incidentally, the bad timing and poor communication, and ends it saying, I am asking you to kindly deliver as soon as possible the dedication copy and my own, however bad or good their paper may be, so that Herr Schwickert does not forget me once again, and the Crown Prince and I are the last. From what I've read about E.B. Schwickert, he got his foot in the publishing business with the help of shady practices. He made himself a representative of a fictitious London publishing business. He accumulated capital making pirated editions. An example of one thing that happened, he got the jump on a rival publisher and published his almanac before theirs, and was thus able to include 19 poems he stole from theirs in his. So that was illegal. And so not only did he get his almanac out before the rival publishers got it out, the rival publishers could look that 19 of their poems were in his. In another occasion, he promised booksellers 104 chapters of a book by Lessing, who had only planned 100 chapters. And Lessing was a famous German writer, one of his biggest clients, one of the biggest writers that Schwickert had. So and Lessing then provided an extra 4 chapters that didn't belong to the theme of the book, but instead talked about the problem of a shady publisher and unpermitted reprints. So I am guessing from the above that Schwickert had things in mind that he felt appealed to his burgeoning bourgeois clientele, and that he wasn't above bending the rules to give it to them. Quantity above quality if necessary, and that they love being pandered to, that they hate feeling small. I think Schwickert had them sussed out. And this is my theory. So in 1780, Bach ruled out an improvement of the text in his Versuch for a third expanded edition. He did provide the additional material. The paragraph 30 of the first 1753 edition should not have been changed. Bach didn't proofread the 1787 edition. He didn't see the change in the 1780 re-release of the 1759 edition. He was 66, semi-retired, I'd imagine, and less in contact with students. And if he knew the 1780 edition was a Druckbildübernahme, or a print image transfer of the second edition, he probably wasn't going to scour the text again if he didn't have any reason to suspect foul play. He'd done all that. Maybe that's where the space played in, you know, the changing streck to streck to narrow it that it wouldn't have all shifted. And if there was too much shifting, Bach would have gone, hold on, I thought this was meant to be a print image transfer. Why is it not ending on the same page? And then he could have investigated further and found the doctored text. But he was 66. His teaching, his contact with students might have been kind of diminished by that stage. And, you know. So Schwickard could make the change, sneak out a number of 1759 editions with the change as an alibi, without it coming to Bach's attention. By selling the rights, Bach lost control. Schwickard was behind the scam, the culprit. That's what I allege. But why change just that sentence? There is recurring evidence of the difficulty of the Versuch and the accompanying 18 practice pieces being an issue that affected sales. In a letter to Schwickard dated February 1783, Bach wrote that many people wanted just the text and no Probestücke, since the latter were too difficult for them. There is additional evidence of that in the continuation of that open letter from 1773 I just read from. Also, what Bach goes on to say in the continuation of that letter shows how resolute he was about not changing the text. Those who assert that my essay is too long say nothing, and at the same time reveal their gross ignorance. I divide all keyboard performers into two groups. In the first are those for whom music is a goal, and in the second, all amateurs who seek thorough instruction. Now, this thorough instruction I think is a bad... Again, I didn't have access to the original German of this open letter, but I don't think this has been translated correctly. And I would see from this, from all the evidence, that this Mitchell guy who has that book is the most famous translation, that translation is not as good as mine. And so the translation you're getting from me on this channel is better than his. He gets it wrong. And I know you are not going to have a hope of figuring out what Bach is saying based on this Mitchell's translation. My translation is a better one to that. If my translation were to come out in book form, it would be the best translation that exists of this book. And I say that without boasting, as Bach puts it. That's just a fact. So the thorough here doesn't fit in the context. And I think Bach is probably meaning something different, because what he's talking about, what he's providing is the thorough thing. So this thorough, and maybe he means like a quick and to the point instruction. You know, not too elaborate. That's what the amateurs are looking for, the quick fix. Just like in YouTube today, the piano tutorial things that have the thousands of subscribers and all, it's the the exercises, the tricks, the gimmicks to be able to, cure tension, improve your speed, improve your memory, all these things. it's all these quick fixes, as if the greatest piano player that they'll ever produce is one that is where he is because he's done finger exercises, breaking it up into rhythms, practicing with the metronome, explored all the different memories, has the greatest muscle memory in the world, as if the greatest artist will be that person. This is, so Bach says, I divide all keyboard performers into two groups. In the first are those for whom music is a goal, and in the second, all amateurs who seek thorough instruction. My essay is intended for the first group. No paragraph is superfluous. So, his essay is for those for whom music is a goal. There you can see the level that this book is at. In fact, it will be seen from the supplements soon to appear that far from having said too much, I have not yet said enough. And this next bit now is as well marred by the poor translation, so it's hard to understand it. And I say that, but in the article, this guy did not say, excuse my interpretation. No, it's left that if you don't understand what Bach is saying, there's something wrong with you. But there's not something wrong with you, there's something wrong with the translation. And that's why it's difficult to understand, because it's not translated correctly. So, teachers must know everything that appears in my essay and be clever enough to select the manner and order of instruction best adapted to the students that they teach. Niceties, that's what this Mitchell guy says, but I'll bet the word that was in that open letter was Feinheiten. And for that translation, the proper translation of Feinheiten here would be subtleties. And Bach talks about Feinheiten in the introduction to the books, and how he structures the second part, and the subtleties come last. So it's badly translated. Niceties come last. Niceties and subtleties are not the same thing. So what it should be, say, is subtleties come last, as expressed in one of my introductions. Nothing fundamental can be learned without time and patience. Study of keyboard performance is not a compendious affair, and compendious means containing or presenting the essential facts of something in a comprehensive but concise way. So, and compendious would mean the exercise to solve your unevenness, the tricks to, play faster, all these things. These are the compendious things. That is not what study of keyboard performance is. And your lessons in the Lilliput professors, it'll be all this keyboard or this compendious stuff. Practice this section, isolate this area, practice it hands separately, practice with the rhythm, and then it's volume control and all. There's no learning of the insight. You're only given the, consecutive fifths are bad. What else can you say about them? You have nothing to say about them. You don't know anything because you haven't been told anything. You're getting this compendious education, which creates useful idiots. That's all it does. If whatever qualities you have, I'll bet you have had to find them and develop them, cultivate them yourself, separate to the education, to the establishment. So study of keyboard performance is not a compendious affair, and dare not be if it is to be learned thoroughly. What is there to say about those false instruction books which in their alleged brevity are almost as long as mine? See, there's again the reference to the double standard, the hypocrisy of Lilliput's roll of honour. That They jump on mistakes and are totally blind to their own, that they commit egregious errors and have no awareness of them. For the second group, the amateurs, there is indeed no instruction book, if this could once be impressed upon their teachers. So I think Bach is saying here, there is no instruction book for amateurs. Amateurs, there's only the first group, those for whom music is a goal. Nothing exists for the amateurs because they are in the cage where nothing exists. They need, if you are an amateur, you need to be listening to this. You need to be considering the things I said, the episode videos. There is no difference for what you need in order to be able to play the piano than a serious music student. And you will end up as with the same virtuosity as I have, which is greater than the virtuosity of Sokolov or of Kissin. And I can say that, and I know that the harder it's studied and the closer it's studied, the more that will be seen. And there's a level of perfection that is just, I don't think people can comprehend it. Because they get, they're so reliant on the piano, the quality, they like how nice the piano sounds. And Sokolov and Kissin will rely on that too. If you sat them down at that piano, you'd be horrified at how bad they sound. So, there is indeed no instruction book, if this could once be impressed upon their teachers. So if the teachers could realize that, the teachers aren't saying to the pupils, there is no instruction book for you. They are providing the tip to solve, this compendious way of teaching. They don't admit that there is, or they don't want to admit or want to realize there is no book for them. They want to tell them there is a book. Oh, certainly, come to me and you'll get all those quick fixes. And they deny you of the goal. You are going to develop a dependency where you'll be 80 years of old and still feel the need of that you need a piano lesson. You will never get to the stage where you feel, right now I'm independent. Now I don't need another lesson for the rest of my life. Whereas with this, with what I can provide, when you're finished with it, you will never feel the need for another piano lesson your entire life. That is not the case with Lilliput's Roll of Honour. You will always feel a need for lessons, and it doesn't matter how old you are, how many lessons you've had, you'll never feel like you don't need them anymore. And this is the bit where the translation makes it sort of hard to understand. Instead, one should proceed as I used to, unwillingly but out of necessity. Before each period, I wrote out the lesson that I intended to give and concerned myself only with the most essential principles, niceties of, and that should be subtleties. So subtleties of and proper contexts for embellishments, refinements of accompaniment, the divided accompaniment, etc., had to be omitted. They were not needed. Throughout, the student was not allowed to commit a single error like those that are accepted as postulates in many books. And postulates are things that are assumed or claimed as true as a basis for reasoning. So what Bach could be saying is here that they weren't, there's errors that are used as postulates that are accepted as postulates in many books. So many books build their entire narrative on fallacies or errors. And so he didn't allow his student to commit those errors that other books, worship as a false god, as the one true God. So throughout, the student was not allowed to commit a single error like those that are accepted as postulates in many books. If the student was prepared, it turned out that the entire transcribed lesson, without examples and the rudiments, which were presupposed, since they can be taught as well by a village schoolmaster as by the greatest artist, filled about a half sheet of paper. Hence, for purposes of thorough instruction, the abridging of a keyboard handbook, even when it is done without errors, clearly does more harm than good. Now that suggests to me that this was a bad translation, because it doesn't make sense. The Bach doesn't make the point he says he's making. And I think he did make the point he says he's making, but it just wasn't communicated with the translation. So, for purposes of thorough instruction, the abridging of a keyboard handbook, even when it is done without errors, clearly does more harm than good. All of the compendium writers that I know have written, in certain respects, too little, in others too much, but in all respects, masses of errors. He's talking about Lilliput's Roll of Honour. They have taken over since. They are now what rule the world. So, all of the compendium writers that I know have written, in certain respects too little, in others too much, but in all respects, masses of errors. What miserable nonsense can be found in some? And this is the reason. To judge from their books, the authors have never studied composition, which they must by all means know in order to construct an accompaniment. This study is not merely of the rules of composition. It bears directly on an understanding of composition. In a word, no one can put his trust in a keyboard instruction book if the author has not previously made himself known and proved himself worthy to be considered an accomplished composer through his good compositions. So, and I'd say that nowadays, that was then when it was it's considered taboo to prescribe anybody else's music. I'd say nowadays, perhaps you could say that if somebody is not able to present an interpretation, and I know, I have the feeling, I see the evidence that it's gotten so bad that people can't recognize an interpretation when they're presented with one. It doesn't exist. They don't understand they can't comprehend what an interpretation is, and they don't recognize one when they see it. But you are not going to be able to learn piano playing from somebody who is not able to interpret. And that as well, what's necessary for interpretation is an understanding of composition. And like he said, not the rules. And the understanding of composition does not come from being in the cage. The understanding of composition comes from being in the world of music. So unless your teacher is telling you he can take you out of the cage and into the world of music, which I'll bet not a single one of them has ever done in their lives, they are not going to be able to teach you how to play the piano. But you will know here on this. That's why I say that, because I am providing the answers. I am providing the means out of the cage. I'm not just giving out and giving nothing. I am providing the solution. In the following letter to Schott, one can see again the issue of difficulty as it relates to sales, and as well see where Bach was willing to concede, with the provision of easier pieces, so not with the changing of the text of the Versuch. This letter to Schott is from Hamburg, January 27th, 1786, so Mozart's birthday. Most noble, highly esteemed Sir, I suppose that the 6 clavier sonatas that your honour requests are to be of the same kind as those I suggested several years ago to promote the sale of my Versuch, namely, entirely new, this is a matter of course, short, easy, and with fingering added. These 6 sonatas, consequently, consist together of 6 pieces and not of 18 pieces, like other sonatas, made up of 3 movements each. The latter kind could not be made for 18 thalers. They would constitute not a supplement to a book, but a whole in themselves, and would, on account of the expense, rather impede the sale. The tear prospective buyers instead of alluring them. Therefore, in order not to have any new vexation, if I am informed of your real intention, then all 6 pieces would be finished within 3 weeks. I remain your honour's most obedient servant, Bach. David Schulenberg, as editor for an edition which included the 6 sonatas, in its introduction, wrote that apparently Schwickert had requested an additional set of 6 sonatas from Bach already in 1780, when Bach transferred the rights to his Versuch to Schwickert. Bach did not grant Schwickert's wish, perhaps because the latter was unwilling to pay 150 thalers for such a set of sonatas. Nevertheless, Bach may have recognized the need for an earlier and easier musical supplement to his treatise, for 3 years later he admitted to Schwickert that the Probestücke increased too fast in difficulty. In the same letter dated 18 February 1783, he offers to sell Schwickert at the most 6 short and easy Probestücke with fingering in a clean copy, delivered within 8 days at the trifling cost, Spottgeld, of 3 thalers each. He states further that he has already completed 1 new Probestück, adding that if Schwickert has no interest in it, he will publish it on his own, incorporating it into a set of 6 sonatas. So difficulty was the issue. Difficulty made Lilliput feel small. They sought the comfort and safety of the cage. In early 1786, Schwickert evidently approached Bach again for 6 sonatas, and the composer replied on the 27th of January, that letter, that the full-length sonatas would more deter than attract buyers, offering to supply instead 6 one-movement sonatas. Schwickert seems to have answered positively, but was not prepared to accept delivery immediately, that is, within the 3 weeks specified by Bach. Some of the relevant correspondence has been lost, but by June Bach had composed the pieces and was having them copied for Schwickert. Schwickert wanted sales. The difficulty in what Bach was sharing was an obstacle to satisfying the wants of his customers. The considerable presence and frequency of the Prall-Trill and the compound trill in paragraph 27, the Prall-Trill and brace combined, in Bach's pieces, regardless of how easy or difficult the pieces themselves are, will have still been obstacles to the public being able to successfully or satisfactorily play them. I don't know how it worked at the time, but I can see that nowadays, with the whole early music movement, the dumbed down thing that passes as a Prall-Trill went and still goes down a treat. The altered text could have been describing a commonly known cheat on how to bypass the difficulty of the Prall-Trill. I'd see that as one option. The only thing about cheats or fakes that inhibits people's enthusiasm for them is that they are cheats. And nobody really wants to knowingly cheat, or at least they can't get excited about it, because a cheat can be an admittance of defeat. But if that cheat is disguised as the correct and only answer, or if the genuine article is wiped from existence and people only know the fake, then Lilliput will embrace it with an unbridled enthusiasm. Their roll of honour will try to outdo each other in how they propagate it, and their minions will defend it to the last. I would say it is one of the factors, besides the instruments, that make the early music movement so popular. It made trills easier. Lilliput and its roll of honour got to be small without being made to feel small in the way that resorting to a cheat will make someone feel small. Schwickert legitimised the cheat. All those elite universities, you know, that early music movement, the Netherlands and all that coming. Schwickert, a conniving publisher, influenced their entire syllabus. I mean, it's a bit hilarious. So Schwickert legitimised the cheat. He pandered to his customers, simplifying the pieces even further. All those experts. Removing the last stumbling block to his helping them or enabling them to continue feeling big. His interest in this can be read out of Bach's 1786 letter, Between the Lines. It is apparent from the 1780 letter that Schwickert was requesting changes to the text, that he had an interest in changing the text. Why was he so interested in improving the text? I mean, the text was practically perfect. How can you get a practically perfect text and express so much interest in improving it? Schwickert doctored the text, and Lilliput's Roll of Honour, your champions. Despite the half-assed job Schwickert did of it, and I'm glad he did such a half-assed job of it, fell for it hook, line and sinker. The experts. Mediocrity could eradicate the Prall-Trill and this compound ornament like they eradicated the dotted rhythm. Had Schwickert doctored Bach's text regarding dotted rhythms, Lilliput would have loved that too. But he didn't. So they had to turn to Leopold Mozart for their Lilliput's fix. I mean, that video I did got very little views, but that changes the landscape of maybe about 40% of the music, like 40% of the musical landscape of the pieces of the time of Bach, Mozart and Beethoven. It's a very important video, and it's hilarious. It's that it got so little views. And Schwickert was facing both complaints at the 18 practice pieces and lackluster sales. So there was the complaints about the pieces on the one hand and lackluster sales on the other. That they got too difficult too quickly for the people, so they were opting not to purchase them with the purchase of the book. Schwickert's one true God and key to his success was that his customers got what they wanted. Schwickert got Bach to provide him with 6 Sonatine Nuove, so 6 new Klavierstücke, easier pieces to appeal to his bourgeoisie clientele. Pieces that could be made even easier still if the problem of the most difficult ornament, the Prall-Trill, and by extension the compound ornament of paragraph 27, which frequently occur in the pieces, was eradicated. The easy pieces didn't work out for 1780. Bach refused to alter the text. What could Schwickert do? He didn't have pieces, but he could change the text, and thus make the pieces that were there easier for his customers by removing the 2 greatest difficulties with regard to their ornamentation. So to legitimize the cheat, it would have been clever of Schwickert, along with the 1780 copies, if he'd have released copies with the 1759 title page, retrofitted with the doctored text as an alibi, if anyone was to accuse him of doctoring the text. He could say, look, in the edition of 1759 that Bach himself published, the text had already been changed. It wasn't me who changed the text, it was Bach. He could frame Bach, if needs must, pin it on him. And you think it wouldn't work on your experts on the Roll of Honour, how in all their glory. So we are going to understand the large bow in this figure 63 in terms of the original explanation as it appeared in the first 1753 edition. All notes are to be struck. The large bow merely indicates the necessary legato, regardless that it extends from the beginning to the end. There'll be more on its performance in the following paragraphs. Plus I have more to present to further debunk and contradict the doctored text, which I shall point out when I come to it. It would have been too much to add it here. One will be to address the idea that what Bach is talking about is an exception, and 3 more will address or relate to the tied second G of the altered, incorrect version. Yeah, so that's that. I wanted to put that out there. And I'll continue on in the next videos with more of this compound ornament. Okay, thanks. Bye.